All right, well, welcome back. Glad to have each of you with us as we finish off tonight. We're reaching a milestone moment in our understanding of the Old Testament, in the sense that we're finishing off, or attempting to finish off tonight, the last book of the 5-volume set, right, of the books of Moses, the Pentateuch, and we're looking at Deuteronomy tonight. So if you brought your Bibles with you, let's go to Deuteronomy, and you can just begin right at don't worry about the camera. It's fine. Don't worry about the camera. And we'll begin at Deuteronomy chapter 1, and we're not going to go through, of course, all the details of it, but there's a couple of things that I would like you to see as we continue on in our series. With Deuteronomy in mind, the fifth of the 5 books of the books of Moses, this, of course, is the last book, and it records Moses' addresses to Israel, all right? So if you want to kind of put the book in its context as to what it's all about, these are Moses' final addresses to the nation of Israel, because they're now preparing, as they did some 40 years previous, they're now preparing to go into the Promised Land. And it's a new generation. It's a new generation of people. The old generation has died off, and the new generation is ready to go in. And so this is Moses' last words, so to speak, as he will be instructing this nation. Now, if we go to the first chapter of Deuteronomy, here's what we find written for us. These are the words which Moses spoke to all Israel on this side of the Jordan, in the wilderness, in the plain opposite Suf, between Paran, Tophel, Laban, Hazeroth, and Dizabah. And what will be happening is, as we go a little later on into our study tonight, we'll see what kind of location that was. But to put it simply, we're in the book of Deuteronomy, we're currently on the east side of the Jordan River, okay, in what they call the plains of Moab, and they are getting ready to cross into the river. So, the closing words of the book, basically, if we go back now or go on to chapter 34, that's the last chapter of Deuteronomy, these closing words are basically the epitaph, we could say, with regard to Moses' life and his career as he did his ministry. As we pick it up in verse 10 of chapter 34, what's written here is, "But since then there has not arisen in Israel a prophet like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, in all the signs and wonders which the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, before Pharaoh, before all his servants, and in all his land, and by all that mighty power and all the great terror which Moses performed in the sight of all Israel." So we begin with the words of Moses, and then we end Deuteronomy with someone else writing about Moses' ministry. So the opening words are the beginning of Moses' address. The closing words of the book memorialize for us, as we have there, the great patriarch's ministry or Moses' ministry. And so that's Deuteronomy in a nutshell. Now, as we normally do, we kind of like to outline the books in a simple way. As we've done with the first 4, let's do the same with Deuteronomy. And we would say this: let's take a look at the first 4 chapters, and we would entitle that simply the past. Okay? What Moses does in the first 4 chapters is he looks back. And what he does is he recounts for, he doesn't go through all the details, of course, but he recounts for this new generation all the things that God did for the people of Israel as they escaped from their bondage in Egypt. Okay? So he looks back, he looks at the past. Then the majority of the book, Moses is looking within. We call this the practical portion of Deuteronomy. Here is where Moses will now be helping this new generation to understand what their responsibilities are going to be in their allegiance to this God who has freed them from bondage, right? Remember, this is a new generation. This is a new relationship with this God. They've heard the stories of old, but now they're needing to establish that relationship themselves with God. And Moses is going to spend a lot of time addressing the practical issues of how this people will relate to this God who has freed them from their bondage. In the next section, we call it prophetical. Here's where Moses begins to look ahead as to what will be expected. And this becomes a bit of a difficult time in this book, because what Moses talks about is he talks about the future disobedience of the people. and what will happen if they and when they do not obey. So it's almost as if Moses is anticipating that since their forefathers had been so rebellious, this generation too will most likely be rebellious. And so what he does in this prophetical way is he shares with them, listen, if you obey, this is what God will do for you. If you disobey, this is what God is going to do to you. All right? And so he's warning them, perhaps thinking if we can warn them strong enough, perhaps they will remain faithful. And then in the last chapters, the book becomes quite personal, where we find Moses looking up. He recognizes, and he already knew this, he recognizes he's not going into the promised land. Remember, he himself was rebellious. When the people of Israel were whining and crying for water, and God said, speak to this rock, what did Moses do instead of speaking to the rock? He struck it twice with his staff. And God said, okay, we can't let that slide. And so Moses would be promised a view. He would be able to look at the promised land. He would see it with his eyes, but he would not enter in. All right? And so these last chapters of Deuteronomy are the most personal, perhaps, of Moses' writing, as well as there will be another addition to the writing that will take place regarding what's happening in Moses' life and what happens at his death as well. So we've taken 34 chapters and we basically stripped it down to 4 major sections. Past, practical, prophetical, personal. It's all alliterated, so it's easier to remember, and that kind of helps us with the outline of what's going on in this last book. With regard to its title, we'll do a little bit of discussion on that as well. And Deuteronomy seems like a funny name, doesn't it? Right? It does seem like a funny name. Deuteronomy is our English title, okay? And like the other titles of the books of Moses, we can take Deuteronomy and trace it back to the Greek Septuagint version of the Old Testament once again, all right? It was, the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, if you remember, okay? And then later on, it was translated into the Greek language, okay? This is where Deuteronomy comes from. In fact, it was given the title Deuteronomian, all right? If you say that 5 times fast, see how it goes for you? And it means literally second law. Now, it's a bit of a misnomer because Moses does not give a new law here, okay? But this is the second time in which he is communicating the law, okay? Remember, it's a new generation. So it's not a new law, but he's going to be sharing it again for this new generation. So actually, when we take a look at the book of Deuteronomy, it does not present another or second law, but repeats and amplifies the basic laws which have been given to the people on Mount Sinai. Remember, they're in a different location now. They're on the plains of Moab. The first time they received the law from Moses, or law from God through Moses, was at Mount Sinai. They're no longer there. They're now on the plains of Moab. This is the second time that Moses will be talking to them about what the expectations are for this nation as they continue to follow God. As far as authorship is concerned, of course, we recognize that it is Moses. The evidence for his authorship in this book especially is quite overwhelming. You can't argue against who the author of Deuteronomy is. When you take a look at specific places in the text, we find that Moses is expressly identified as the author. Okay, there's several times where God says, Moses, write this down. Or Moses talks about the writings that he refers to. It's interesting, too, as we look outside just Deuteronomy itself, Jesus and the New Testament writers, who, by the way, quote Deuteronomy more than any other Old Testament book, associate Moses as being the author of this book. Someone has, I don't know who has said it, but someone has once said that Deuteronomy was Jesus' favorite book. And when you take a look at his earthly ministry, the vast majority of the Old Testament quotations that he gives are directly from Deuteronomy, okay? As well as other New Testament writers, and they ascribe authorship to Moses. Internally, as well, its message, the message of Deuteronomy, best fits the times and ministry of Moses as we have record of that, and so the Mosaic authorship is really overwhelming. You just can't get around it or through it. Now, of course, there's questions with regard to chapter 34, because this records Moses' death, and how can a dead man record his own death? Well, that's not possible. So it's obvious that someone else must have written that portion, or that chapter. We think probably Joshua was the one who wrote that. Reason being, when you read the last chapter of Deuteronomy and when you read the first chapter of Joshua, the similarities are uncanny. And we'll see that when we get into Joshua. But we think probably Joshua was the one who wrote that. In fact, that's what we have there for the next point. Yeah, Joshua, Moses' friend and successor, may have written that chapter as a form of an obituary. Because remember, once Moses died, the people were in mourning for 30 days. All right? And just recognizing the influence that Moses had with this people. As far as date is concerned, when did Moses write this? Well, we think probably soon after he delivered the addresses that he delivered. If you go to verse 3 of chapter 1, it's recorded there for us. Now it came to pass in the 40th year, in the 11th month. So we have some dating going on here. In the 40th year, in the 11th month, on the first day of the month, that Moses spoke to the children of Israel according to all that the Lord had given him as commandments to them. All right? So sometime after this point, we figured Moses was probably writing down all that he had said. And of course, it would be shortly before his death, which we estimate his death is around 1405 BC. Okay? So sometime previous to that, but not too far before that. The setting whereby he is writing this book, the circumstances under which Deuteronomy was written are clear. Israel had reached the border of Canaan, and now they're getting ready to cross over and to go into this land that God had promised some 40 plus years previous. Okay? They'd finally come to that place. And so this is the setting in which Moses is writing. Probably a lot of excitement, a lot of perhaps anxiety, not knowing what's beyond the river, not knowing what they'll have to perhaps deal with. And so this is the setting in which Moses is writing. So 40 years earlier, the nation had been on the border of the land, but because of unbelief and disobedience, the people were not allowed to enter. We saw that in Exodus, right? And so here's where we see what is taking place with this new generation. So this time, what they had to do was tarry on the banks of the Jordan until they learned this one lesson. And it was a simple lesson in its content, but a challenging lesson in its practice, right? They had to learn that they had to trust, they had to obey God. They needed to do things differently than what the previous generation had done. They had not been obedient. In fact, Paul the Apostle, when he writes to the Corinthians, talks about the fact that the first generation is an example to us. An example to us of what we're not to be doing when it comes to being disobedient toward God. So this is the lesson that they would learn, and they would be on the banks of the Jordan for a little time, going through the addresses that Moses had. So, as Moses being the lawgiver, as he was about to leave them, what he does is he gathers the people together for the last time, and he delivers his basic farewell address. The other name we give it, Deuteronomy. All right? So that kind of helps, I think, with understanding what's going on with this book and the content of this book. When you think of Deuteronomy, or when you come across the term Deuteronomy, rather than thinking of second law, think of this. Last words, okay? Or memorial, or whatever it is that you might want to put in there to help us remember what the content of this book is about. Now, what is interesting, too, when we look at Deuteronomy, is we find that there are some distinctive characteristics as we compare Deuteronomy with Leviticus and Numbers. We find some similarities, and and we find some differences. And so this is a bit interesting as we look into it. For example, we would say this, that Deuteronomy resembles Leviticus in its scarceness of action sections. Remember how we talked about Leviticus at times being a hard book to read? We get bogged down into it, and Numbers would be the same thing. Guess what? The same thing can happen with Deuteronomy as well. Why? Because there's not a lot of action taking place. Okay? There is Moses talking and addressing the people as to what they need to do, how they need to do it, what God expects of them. And just like it was being done in Leviticus, just as it was being done in Numbers, it does tend to get a little dry. So that's one of the similarities that we see. The books are also similar in that the instructions contained in each were given to Israel while they were in standby encampment. For example, the content of Leviticus, where was the nation? They were at Mount Sinai. Okay? And they stayed there, we estimate, for probably a year. Okay? As Moses would communicate the law to the nation. All right? And so they were in what we would call standby encampment when Leviticus was being communicated. Same with Deuteronomy. Where are they now? They're on the plains of Moab. Okay? They're in standby encampment. They're getting ready to move. Okay? But they can't move yet until they receive the instruction that they're going to receive. As we continue with the comparison, before we get there, here's a map that shows, again, the area of what's happening with these people. Mount Sinai, traditionally it has been thought that Mount Sinai was around here on the Sinai Peninsula, but more research would share with us that probably Mount Sinai, where they received the law, was probably over here. Here's the Gulf of Suez and the Red Sea and all the rest of it. Egypt is over here. Remember, they crossed the Red Sea and came down to this area. Probably they were around here when they received the law the first time. Now where are they? They're in the plains of Moab. Okay, they're on the east side of the Jordan River. There's the Dead Sea on the east side of the Jordan River, and they're probably around this area here. Okay, so that gives you an idea of the geography of what's happening. And as they are there, in Leviticus, what were they anticipating? They were anticipating their wandering life. Remember, they received the law, and so now they need to go toward wherever this promised land is. Because remember, they don't know. They're depending upon God to lead them. Of course, with the disobedience and all the rest of that, they wandered for all that time. In Deuteronomy, they were making preparations for their settled life. So in Leviticus, they were making preparations for a wandering life. Deuteronomy, they're making preparations for a settled life. They're finally going to do it. They're finally going to go into the promised land. Another difference here, the two books, Leviticus and Deuteronomy, the reason why they're different is that, look at this, Leviticus was given mainly for the instruction of the priests and the Levites. That's why we call it Leviticus, remember? Levites, the priestly realm of the tabernacle worship. Deuteronomy was given to instruct the Israelite laymen. Okay? The priestly instruction has already been given. Don't really need to repeat that because the priestly order continues on. But for this new generation, they need to know how they need to respond. Okay? So as we do some comparisons between Deuteronomy, Leviticus, and Numbers, we find some interesting factors. One more thing. Deuteronomy also supplements by additions and explanations some of the things already recorded in the earlier books. So as you read Deuteronomy, it's good to read Deuteronomy after you have read Leviticus. Okay? If you try to read Deuteronomy before Leviticus, you'll miss out on some things. Because again, Moses doesn't go through all of the same detail as when in Exodus and Leviticus. He's already assuming that the first generation has passed down some of these things to the next generation. All right? But he's going to also add some things in, explain some things a little further that perhaps the first generation didn't have the benefit of learning from. All right? So, yeah, the connections between those books, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, we see some connections, we see some differences, all in relation to how this nation is going to survive as they go into this promised land. Corresponding subjects, we want to deal with that too. We deal with that with each of the books that we go through. So let's first of all talk about this. As we talked about in the first 4 chapters, Moses deals with the past, right? He looks back. And so we want to see the remembrances of the past that Moses has for them. It was natural for Moses to refer to history first. What he wanted to do is he wanted to let experience be their teacher. This is what the first generation experienced. Learn from them. Learn well. Don't make the same mistake is basically the lesson that Moses is trying to get across. You've heard the saying before, right? That those who do not take stock well of history are in danger of repeating it, right? And this is what Moses wanted to try and prevent. He didn't want this second generation to repeat the same mistakes that the first generation made. So that's why he goes to the past. He says, this was our experience as we were a fledgling nation. Don't make the same mistake. Let experience be your teacher. Now, again, not every event in Israel's journey from Egypt was reviewed in Deuteronomy, but basically only those from which Moses would draw his arguments. And so as a good exercise sometime, if you want to do this, as you go through Deuteronomy and as you read the first 4 chapters, compare what he teaches to what we have recorded for us in Exodus and Leviticus, and see what is left out, or what Moses leaves out in Deuteronomy, just to give yourself an idea of the differences between the two, and what Moses really concentrates on as he talks about the past. Of course, there's some commandments for the present as well. This is the vast majority of the book where we do find that most of Deuteronomy records the laws of God for Israel. And again, here's why we get after chapter 4, when we get into this next part, we find this gets a little heavy slogging again for us, because we're not connected historically, we're at a distance. We're not necessarily understanding all of what these laws would represent or would demand. And Deuteronomy does the same thing. But if we were going to give a general outline of these chapters, going from the end of 4 into midway through 26, here's how I would put it. Basically, the first part, Moses reviews with them again the basic commandments. Okay? The basic commandments of the law that God gives. Of course, we've got to talk about laws of worship and holy living, just like they did in Leviticus, right? And that has to be reviewed. And then, yes, punishments for specific offenses. Here's where we begin to get into a little bit of a struggle sometimes with the text, because some of the punishments that Moses talks with them about are punishments that we would find rather difficult to understand. For example, we find in there a punishment that if a child is not honoring their father or their mother, or being disobedient to their father or mother, that a suitable punishment was to be stoned to death. Okay? Wow. Okay. That's a little different than what we would think. If a woman was assaulted sexually, okay, was raped by a man, the law would demand that the person who perpetrated the crime would have to pay an exorbitant fee to the father of the daughter, okay, and would have to marry that daughter, okay. Seems rather kind of going, wow, this is interesting. So this is where sometimes we get into a lot of discussions when we get into the punishment for specific offenses. We get into a lot of discussion with regard to how can this be fair, how could God permit this, or how would God want this as part of his law, all the rest of it. We're not going to go into all the details of that, but just understand, let's be honest, it's there in the text, and we wrestle with it, and we sometimes struggle with it. But yeah, the commandments for the present. This is what this nation needs to be doing, how they need to be working as they would go into this promised land. Because remember, they're going to be a unique people, right? They're going to be unique among all the other nations round about. Not only are they going to be unique, but they are going into a land that's already occupied. Remember. And as they go into that land, and as they occupy occupy that land, they are taking over that land from the people who are already there. Okay? So some real distinct tensions are going to be taking place. How is this nation going to survive? That's why Moses is helping them again with understanding what God would expect of them and want of them, so that they would survive in those conditions. There's some options affecting the future as well. Here's where we find some really interesting things that take place. One of the first things that they were instructed to do, they don't do this in Deuteronomy, they'll do this later on. But one of the things that they're instructed to do in Deuteronomy is, as they establish themselves in the promised land, they're to march to two mountains. They're very close together. Okay? And I'll show you a picture a little later on. Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. And these two mountains basically are in the center of the promised land where they are going. And what they are to do is they are to set up some great plastered stones on these mountains on which the law of God was to be written. Okay? And this was going to be a reminder to them of the law that they had been given, that they were to follow as they entered into the land. So here we have a map, and Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim are right there, kind of just right by each other. And I got a picture of the actual mountains a little later on in our slides, so you can see just how close they are together. There's a valley in between. Okay, 6 tribes were to stand on Mount Gerizim to declare the blessings upon the people for obedience to this law. So 6 tribes. Remember, we're talking about 2 million plus people. Okay. So let's just roughly make the math. Let's make the math both rough and simple. How many tribes? 12. 12 tribes total. Okay. 6 tribes are going to Mount Gerizim, and they're going to be responsible for declaring to the people on the other mountain, okay, the blessings of God as they would be obedient to the law. The other 6 tribes are going to stand on the other mountain opposite them, on Mount Ebal, okay, and they're going to declare curses upon the people for disobedience. So you've got roughly 1 million people on both mountains, okay. Now how they choreograph this, I have no idea. Can you imagine? Trying to get them to say the same thing at the same time, right? But this is what they were to do. And this picture here kind of gives you an idea of the topography. Here on this side is Mount Gerizim. There's just the edge of it, okay? There's the valley, and across you see Mount Ebal, okay? So the valley is going to kind of act as an amplifier, okay? So that as they shout back and forth to each other, and they would do this antiphonally. What we mean by that is the 6 tribes on one mountain would say one thing, and then the 6 tribes on the other mountain would respond to what was said. So as the blessings on Mount Gerizim were talked about, they would say a blessing, and then antiphonally the 6 tribes on the side would announce a curse for disobedience. And it would go back and forth like this. Now can you imagine? Okay? You've got 2 million plus people. They're both talking to each other. Okay? They're announcing blessings and they're announcing cursings. And imagine if you happen to reside in the valley. What would that do to you? It just may do that, right? You've got a nation of people who have come in, and they are now going to talk about the blessings and cursings of God. This would have been quite the spectacle. But this was designed by God for a couple of things we can conjecture, okay? One is to remind the people of the responsibility, now that they've entered into the land. What is our responsibility for obedience? What will happen if we don't obey? So let's remind it. And basically, when they're talking about the blessings and the cursings, they're talking about the same thing that Moses talked about with them when he talked about it in Deuteronomy. Okay, so they're just repeating what Moses had taught. But what it's also declaring to the nations round about is that we're here. Okay? We're here and we're establishing ourselves. And we are establishing ourselves under the authority of the one true God. Okay? Because remember, nations that are there are polytheistic nations. They worship many gods. But this is a nation that worships one God, the only true God. And so God has purposes behind why this is all going on, and this was one of the things that they were instructed to do as Moses instructed them as they would enter into the promised land and establish themselves. They don't do it in Deuteronomy. We find that they do it later on, and it's recorded for us later on. But that's what they were doing. Okay? So a spectacle in itself. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall to see all that. It would have been amazing just to see it.
Thinking, I wish they had the internet.
Right, yeah. They had the internet. YouTube, right? Wouldn't it have been great? Yeah.
But to hear a million voices, that would be pretty loud.
It would be pretty loud, yes. Yeah, and there's some discussion as to whether or not, rather than just chanting it or saying it, they may have sung it. Okay, there may have been music that was put with that. Okay, it's a possibility. Which again, that would have been something to behold in itself, right? Of course, we have to deal with the parting words of Moses. We come across that as we begin into chapter 31. Remember, the people who have been camping on the east side of the Jordan, they're waiting to cross over. And basically, in these parting words that Moses has for them, these people are given three things. First of all, they're given their final charge. Okay? If there's anything I want you to remember, here's what I want you to remember. That's basically what Moses is doing. Also, what he does here is he gives them an interpretation of the philosophy of God's judgments in history. Here's why God did what he did with your forefathers. Here's why he will do to you what he will do to you as you are faithful or as you are disobedient. So he's helping them understand the nature and the character of God and what it is that he expects of them. Also, one of the things that they're given as well by Moses is a reminder of the blessings awaiting the people of the land. This is one of the things that Moses wanted to make sure that they would understand. This is something that God has given. I haven't given it to you. It hasn't been me that's done all of this. This is what God has done. And this is what God desires to do. This is what God desires to do with you as a people. This is what God desires to do with you as a nation. And if you will only trust him, if you will only obey him, you will not be able to comprehend all the blessings that God will give if you follow him. But that's the condition. You have to follow him. You can't do this on your own. You must follow him. And so these are the final words that Moses will have. Now, we would think, because Moses knows that he's not going into the promised land, he has been told that he cannot enter because of his sinfulness, right? Because of his unfaithfulness, we could say. We would probably be willing to cut Moses some slack, right, on the tone of his words, right? Again, remember, these are his last words. And he knows these are his last words. But yet, we find that the parting words of Moses are not bitter ones. As you read the text, they're bright, they're warm, they're hopeful. God, or Moses wishes nothing but the best for God's people as they would enter into the land. The only way he's getting into the land is if they carry his bones. But they won't even be able to do that, because we find that the text tells us that God is the one who buries Moses on top of the mountain. All right? We have no idea where Moses was buried. We have no idea. But it was God who buried him. And the rest, as they say, is history. But yeah, the parting words of Moses, they're not bitter. They're warm. They're bright. They're hopeful. And we basically, when we come to the end of Deuteronomy, we have come to the end, really, of an era. We've come to the end of an era. But yet we're still only starting the first 5 books of the Old Testament. All right? But we've already come to the end of the era.
Well, I find it hard to imagine that if someone was walking in front of me at night, a pillar of flame, and in the daytime a pillar of smoke, I find it hard to imagine that you would not want to follow instructions to the letter in every possible way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But Satan must have been working night and day there.
Yeah, if it was just me, perhaps. But when you get 2 million plus people, now you get into the whole aspect of, what's the majority doing, right? That kind of thing. Plus, we could maybe, again, I know that you're not trying to do this part, but at the same time, do we not sometimes, are we not guilty of doing the exact same thing? Because we may not have a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, but we do have his actual words, right? And we have them available to us. They're in our language. We can read what God says. It's not a case where we're now hearing it from the prophet Moses. We can read actually what God says. And because we know it is from God, we know it is his word, you would think that we would want to follow it to the letter. But what do? Right? At times we get our eyes off it, and we do our own thing. Okay? So again, I think what happens there, as we see the Old Testament people in their unfaithfulness, their disobedience, we see the exact same heart that you and I have, right? With regard to what we're like when we have the exact words of God and we know what it is that he wants of us. But yet, what will we do? Sometimes we'll argue with him. Or we'll say, well, I know that's what it says, but that must apply to somebody else. That really doesn't apply to me, does it? And all the rest of those rationalizations that we go through, right? There was rationalizations that they went through too. They saw the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night, but you get a bunch of people around the campfire, and one brings up the complaint, and what does the other majority do around the campfire? They're complaining too, right? And before you know it, you're caught up in it. The heart of humanity.
Social media is an example.
How so?
Right?
How so?
It's an example of people following the crowd,
Right.
following the great numbers. So
Yeah.
you guys that need to spoil your Facebook. or whatever.
Well, let's go to that question that I think is the most important to ask. Okay, we have this fifth book, this fifth volume. What about it? So what? What does it mean for me? All right, I see how they get prepared to enter into the promised land finally. But what does it mean for me? Well, first of all, I would say this. Deuteronomy is a supplementary book, and it's supplementary to the rest of the Pentateuch. And what it does is it fills in the missing elements and gives the spiritual significance of the history found in the other books of Moses. So in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, we see that historical element, right? Moses shares that historical element with us. But now what Deuteronomy does for us is gives us a little more. And it shares with us a more of the spiritual significance behind these instructions, these laws that God gives. And so it helps me to get beyond just the dry history, right? Talking about theology of dead men, I mean, that would be a good way to put it, right? But Deuteronomy gives us more of the spiritual significance. Because Deuteronomy reminds us of the importance of periodically looking back to our own important spiritual experiences. Isn't that what Moses did? He looked back with the children of Israel and he said, okay, here's these important spiritual experiences that took place for your forefathers. Here's the lessons that we need to learn from that. Let's talk even about some of the important spiritual experiences that you had as we've come to this point in place. Now, what can we learn from that? Okay? In other words, I think what Deuteronomy can remind us of is, listen, even as we take a look back into our own lives, and we take a look at some of the important spiritual experiences that we had, from the very first time that you came into a relationship with Jesus Christ to the point that you are now in your spiritual walk, it's good to look back at some of those important spiritual happenings, those experiences that you had, because they do a couple of things for us. One of the things that it does for us is it reminds us again of God's faithfulness to us, right? When you think back and you look back, you go, wow, this could have gone this way and this could have gone that way. And you begin again and you're reminded again of the faithfulness of God. It's not that we want to live in the past, because that's not what Moses wanted to do either. But it's important to see some of those important spiritual experiences we had, to encourage us as we continue in our walk. Because you do it as well as I do. At times in our spiritual walks, things get a little boring or dry, right? Things get a little off base a bit, right? Because we lose focus. Going back and seeing what God has done can get us back to doing what it is that we need to be doing.
That makes me think of doing our go and do for this next week.
Right.
And the part in there was saying, like, when you're trying to talk to you about Jesus,
Right.
is going back on your spiritual experiences to help make inroads into people's lives.
Right, to help them understand the reality of Christ. This is not just an ideology. This is a relationship, and that's what makes it different. If I have no stories to tell, how do I make that come alive in people's lives and minds, right? Also, Deuteronomy reminds us of God's law of recompense. What we mean by that is this: you know what? He can bless obedience. But let's also remember, He also can punish disobedience. If God would do this for His people back then, guess what? Since He is the same yesterday, today, and forever, He will and can do the same thing for us. He blesses His people when we are obedient. Now, how He blesses people when they're obedient, I mean, that's left up to His sovereign imagination, right? So unfortunately, some people get going way off base on this and say, okay, if you're wealthy, that means that God is happy with your obedience and your faithfulness. If you're not wealthy, then you must be doing something wrong. You must be sinning. No. That's not what we're talking about here at all. What we're talking about is simply this: God blesses His people when they are obedient, and He also, when it's necessary, will punish His people when we're being disobedient. Remember what the Hebrew writer said? Okay? We talked about this earlier this afternoon, didn't we?
Yes.
Remember what the Hebrew writer said? Let's not try to avoid, or let's not despise the chastening of our Heavenly Father. Why? Because when He chastens us, we know this for a fact: He loves us. He loves us. Okay? If God didn't care, He wouldn't do anything. Okay? But because He cares so much, He does some things. He blesses us for our obedience, and at times it's necessary to punish us for our disobedience. Deuteronomy also teaches us much about God's sovereignty and holiness. You can't read this book without getting the impression that God continues to be in control. To be in control in magnificent and remarkable ways. When you consider what this nation has gone through to get to this point of being on the plains of Moab, getting ready to cross into the promised land. What did God have to do through all of that time? Remarkable things. We see His sovereignty, but we also see His holiness as well. God isn't just going to let the people go willy-nilly into the promised land and do whatever it is they want to do. No. He has specific responsibilities that He has for them. One of the responsibilities, in fact, that He has for them, and when you read the text, is this: that He wants them to be the communicators of the only true God to the nations round about who need to know about the only true God. Today, in our New Testament times, we call it evangelism. That's exactly what God wanted them to do as they entered into the promised land. You evangelize these people. They need to know about me.
So had they done that, how would things have been so totally different?
They could have been.
Supposed to visit people out of the country, the land, weren't they?
Yeah.
So if they had evangelized us, and the other thing it says we need to be doing here.
Right.
What a different outcome that would have been.
Yeah, and all we can do is speculate because we don't know what could have happened with all of that. But that was one of the responsibilities that they had, was to evangelize the people. Okay? And so this is a book that teaches as much about His sovereignty, God's sovereignty and God's holiness. But I want you to see this too when it comes to Deuteronomy. Let's not forget again Moses. He's the main character here. And Moses is what we would call a type of Christ. And he's a type of Christ in many ways. Because Moses is the only biblical figure, other than Christ, for example, to fill the three offices of prophet, priest, and king. Remember, that was the three offices of Jesus Christ. He was prophet, priest, and king. Moses filled those three offices as well. He was the prophet, right? He was the prophet of God. He was also the priest in the fact that he was the intermediary between the people and God. And even though he was not literally a king, he was the ruler of the people. He was the leader of the people, okay? Under God's authority. So Moses is the only biblical figure, when you compare all the other biblical figures that are recorded for us, he's the only one that fulfills those three offices of prophet, priest, and king. Jesus Christ did that, by the way. Okay? So we see some connections there. We also see some other connections too. Remember, both were in danger of death during their childhood. Moses was in danger of death. That's why he was put into the basket, right? And led out to the Nile River. What was Herod's edict when Jesus was born? All male children 2 years and under were to be eliminated. That's why Joseph and Mary moved to another location out of Herod's jurisdiction. Both were in danger of death during their childhood. Both, as we take a look at their ministries, their earthly ministries, both are saviors, intercessors, and believers, right? Moses was the savior for the nation of the people, under the authority of God, of course, but he was the one that delivered the people from their bondage, okay, under the authority and power of God. Moses was an intercessor for the people. Several times, God comes to Moses and says, listen, these people, I'm tired of them. I'm sick of them. Let's just start over. I'll wipe these people out and let's just start over with you. And Moses says, well, let's talk about this a little further. He intercedes on behalf of the people, right? And believers, the factor of followers of God's mission for them as they would do the things that they would do. We also find this as well. Isn't it interesting? Both are rejected by their people as well. When Moses came back from Midian to tell the people what God had told him, do you remember? All the people were so enthused and they were ready to go, and they said, when do we begin packing? Isn't that what they said when Moses came back? Not at all. Who do you think you are? Who do you think you are that you can deliver us? Who told you that you should be doing this? I'm not so certain. They were rejected at the beginning. Okay, Moses was rejected at the beginning by the people that he was sent to deliver. Remember what Jesus said during his earthly ministry? Prophet is without honor in his own country. I mean, if there was anybody that was rejected by his people, it was Jesus Christ, right? Right to the very point where they crucified him. Okay. So it's interesting when you take a look at the life of Moses, and when you take a look at the life of Christ. What is Moses really for us? Well, he certainly is the one who led the nation of Israel out of bondage with Egypt by the power and hand of God, of course. But Moses is also a hint for us. A hint of something else. A hint that someone else was going to be coming and was going to be able to fulfill what it was that they were going to be able to fulfill. In fact, I haven't got the passage off hand, I don't think. No, but Moses in his writing in Deuteronomy talks about a prophet who will come, who will do even greater things than he did. Who was Moses talking about? Well, I don't think Moses at the time that he was writing that understood that he was talking about the Messiah, Jesus, because there wasn't enough information to put all that together. But now that we have the entire scriptures, we know exactly what Moses was talking about. That prophet who was to come would be Jesus. And he would be the one that would be the greatest of all the prophets of the times of the children of Israel. So, yeah, the book of Deuteronomy. It might be the final volume of the 5-volume set, but it shares with us so many things again and reminds us again how we need to be looking forward, right? We need to be looking forward. All of this, those first 5 books, what are they doing? They're giving us hints upon hint upon hint upon hint of God's redemptive plan. Not just for his people, the Israelites, but for you and me as well. And we see how all of that began as we took a look at the Pentateuch, the books of the law of Moses. Well, that completes the Pentateuch. What book do we have after Deuteronomy? Joshua. When we get together next time, that's where we will dive into. We will dive into Joshua and begin a new era in Old Testament history and see what is there for us, what we can learn about, and what we can apply to our lives as we continue understanding the Old Testament. Let's pray. Father, again, thank you for your word, for the time that we've been able to spend looking into it and seeing its significance. We thank you for the life of Moses, how he is an example to us and how he continues to be an example to us. We thank you how you have made it for these first 5 books of the Old Testament to already begin pointing us forward to that wonderful redemptive plan that you had formulated in your mind and heart before the foundation of the world was even formed. Father, we have been reminded again of your greatness. We've been reminded again of your holiness. We have been reminded again of your great love and mercy toward us. And as we go from this place, and as we go on to the other things of the day, Father, go before us. Keep us mindful of your presence. We pray it in Jesus' name. Amen.